Okay, we'll get started. It's with my very great pleasure. I'm Lexi Lazick and I'm a senior lecturer here in the School of Education. And unfortunately, Amy Carter-Mackenzie can't join us to introduce the wonderful Natalie Osborne, so she has asked me to do it in her stead. So Dr. Osborne is a lecturer in the School of Environment at Griffith University, teaching and researching into the areas of urban and environmental planning and critical human geography. Oh, this is why we have some intersections in our work, isn't it? Her work focuses on social, spatial and environmental justice in cities, spatial politics and the right to the city. She has conducted research in the areas of activism and disasters, and intersectional feminist theory, mind closure and transition planning, transport justice and mobilities, emotional geographies and unspeakable planning problems. So much richness in there, Natalie. She has a particular interest in community-based participatory action research, working with community groups, radical and activist organisations and marginalised peoples. She's currently engaged in collaborative action research with the grassroots organisation Right to the City, Brisbane, of which she is also co-founder. So please make Natalie welcome to Southern Cross University. Thank you.
Good afternoon, folks. Thanks for joining me. I'd like to first pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today, although I realise that's actually many lands. We're currently on Komkomeri Ugambe country. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands I live and work on, the Jagera, Yagara, Yugara and Yugarapul peoples of Mianjin, Brisbane, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and that sovereignty was never ceded. This is particularly important when talking about the issues I'm going to be talking about today around spatial justice and the right to the city. So thank you to Professor Amy Carter-Mackenzie and of course to the entire Sustainability, Environment and Education Research Cluster for having me here today. I won't rehash my intro, thank you. It's always really embarrassing when someone actually reads out the bio that you have to write. But I'll talk really quickly about what it is I'm doing today. So the work I'm talking to you about is ongoing. A lot of it's going to sound quite theoretical, I think. And I'm not sure who I've got here today, so if I'm saying anything that needs further explanation, please just let me know. Wave your hands or hold up a sign or something, or just interrupt, that's totally cool. But I want to kind of flag something at the outset of this that I think will become clearer as I talk through this, that the theory I'm talking today does not emerge from books. I mean, it certainly comes from books, but basically these are ideas and concepts and theories that are emerging in the organising spaces that I'm going to be talking to you about today. These ideas, the conversations, the actions that I've been engaged in with these people have sent me looking for frameworks and structures and ideas to put around this kind of messy thinking assemblage of people in place to understand what it is that's been happening in Brisbane. And so this is why a bunch of the theories and ideas I'm talking about today will probably seem like a really odd collection of influences, which I'm trying to make talk to each other. It's because I didn't come into this with a plan. I'm embedded with these people, with this community, and I'm trying to find a way to articulate what it is that's happening. So with that like massive disclaimer, I'm sure you're all like really excited to hear what I'm going to say, but we'll get into it. First of all, I will just explain this photo because this is a photo from the Portland anarchist road care crew. So this is a tactical urbanist group. I'm going to talk a little bit later about tactical urbanism. But basically they are anarchists who go around and they fix potholes in their city. This is what they do. This is their anarchist praxis, is teaching themselves, teaching each other how to fix potholes and organising, going out with witches' hats and balaclavas to make their streets safer to be on. And this is very much the kind of talk I'm going to be, this is a kind of what a friend called a tender insurrection. This is what I'm talking to you about today. Radical activities that are often actually illegal. This is definitely an example of completely illegal activity, but done to make cities better and done through collaboration. So it's a radical politic, but with a kind of warmth and with a kind of joy and with a kind of care. So why do we need such a radical politic? What is it that we're missing? We are missing spaces for struggle. So what we've lost in the late 20th and in the early 21st century, a lot of the sites of struggle and organisation that we used to have. We've seen the demise of civil society in many contexts. Workplaces are no longer the sites for organising that they once were. Unions, we've seen them largely collapse. We've also seen a diminished public realm. So the public spaces of cities, there's not only fewer of them and often poorer quality, but they're increasingly privatised. And even when they're not privatised, they're increasingly commodified. One of my regular personal beefs as someone who lives in Brisbane is I frequently ride my bike along South Bank parklands, which are very beautiful in lots of ways and have lots of interesting features about them. But they're also a highly controlled place. So if you look like you might want to spend the night there, you're going to be moved on pretty quickly, particularly if you also happen to look like you might be Aboriginal. And that space is also sections of it are frequently cordoned off for festivals that are like for-profit festivals that charge entry to get in, or where you have to spend money in order to participate in that place. So even though this is considered a kind of award-winning public space, the public that's actually welcome on South Bank, that's something that's limited and limiting in lots of ways, and there's lots of ways that gets policed. We are also, I think, atomised by neoliberalism. I think many of us have been trained to think about ourselves as individuals. We often feel cut off from relationships of care, relationships of solidarity with each other, with our neighbours. And this is something that we are missing, and we see the effect that this has on us. It has effects on our material well-being, it has effect on our psychological well-being, our emotional well-being, and our capacities to live together. But I also think something we've lost is a future. So Mark Fisher wrote in Capitalist Realism 2009 book that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And what he's saying here is that we have become so convinced by capitalism, this present moment in capitalism, which he calls capitalist realism, which some of us might call neoliberalism, has convinced us that this is literally the only way our society can be. And that all of our relationships are then mediated through this system. So when we see, and Mark Fisher works a lot with fiction and with music, he writes about these representations of the end of the world, the kind of apocalyptic representations that we see in films like Children of Men, as suggesting that it's actually easier to imagine the collapse of everything that we know, this slow decline into oblivion, than it is to imagine a world that could be fundamentally different. He says that capitalist realism is not a particular type of realism, this belief in capitalism as being the only way that we can build and exist and be with one another. It is realism itself. I'm going to return a little bit to this idea of realism throughout the talk, because I think part of what we need to understand when we are thinking about our present mode of existence and why the kinds of things I'm talking to you about today feel necessary is because we have lost a sense of an alternate future. And yet we know, under widening insecurity, the imminent destruction of climate change, the future that we do have access to seems pretty bleak. But it does also serve existing structures, existing governance structures, existing political economies, if we believe that this is the only way that our cities can be, if we believe that this is the only way our societies can be organised. So it serves capitalist realism, it serves neoliberalism for us to be mono-realists, for us to also believe that there is no other future, there is no other way for us to live together. Now, as an aside, I was kind of wondering if it would be a problem to launch into an anti-capitalist critique on slide 3, if this is something I should warm you all up to a little bit more. But honestly, the kind of urban activism I'm talking to you about today can only be understood by understanding what is being resisted. And what is being resisted are these dominant structures of capitalism that shape urban governance, that shape urban planning processes, that are so dominated by neoliberalism. So, okay, in the context of this diminished public realm, in the context of weakened unions, in the context of a fractured civil society, in the context of futurelessness, what have we got? We've got the city. So, I think what we can do is think about the city as a kind of collective project. The city is something that we are all producing and reproducing. The city is, as David Harvey says, a vast common produced by the collective labour expended on and in the city. And if that's the case, the right to use that common must then be surely accorded to those who have had a part in producing it. And this is why we are beginning to see cities themselves as being a space, figurative and literal, through which we can organise under our present conditions of neoliberalism. When we've lost those old kinds of organising structures, cities themselves seem to be providing a new kind of structure. Harvey also writes that the city and urban processes that produce it are major sites of political, social and class struggle, and that there is something political in the city air struggling to be expressed. Part of the reason why this is the case is because cities make power visible in ways that power is often not visible. Power is made visible in urban spaces, and this is done through the way, the really obvious material ways that space is produced and commanded. Physical buildings are a way that power makes itself visible in space, in cities, but also in the command of space, in the control of space, in the policing of space, the surveillance that we are increasingly subjected to in cities, as well as cities are home to the administrative arm of the state. So cities become sites of friction, they become sites of contact, they become sites of encounter and of difference. And it's through cities that we can produce new identities, that we can produce new modes of being that come about through this friction, the energy generated by our encounters with difference and our encounters with one another. So in that sense, it kind of makes sense for cities to be the site of political contestation, to be the home of where these arguments about power, these arguments about the structures that govern our material conditions, it makes sense that they would emerge in cities. But the kind of urban activism I want to talk to you about today takes this one step further. Rather than just seeing the city as the site of political contestation, to use words from Fran Tonkus, the city becomes the stakes of the political contestation as well. So we are not fighting in cities, although we're fighting for cities. So the goal that we're talking about in these struggles for space, broadly speaking, can be conceptualized as the just city. So basically, really quickly, I'm not going to go into this in too much depth, because I think the important thing about the just city is that it's an adaptable but normative goal. So it's the idea that we should be striving for a city in which justice and equity are privileged over the kind of pro-growth model of development that our cities have been subjected to. It is an assertion, a belief that another kind of city is possible. That's why it's kind of useful and inherent in the kinds of struggles that we're talking about today. So where urban processes have been dominated by capitalism, when they've been dominated by neoliberalism, cities are not only rapacious, they not only consume resources in ways that are actually physically changing the planetary systems that we rely on for our survival, but cities are also increasingly unjust. We do tend to see heightened injustices in cities, and we tend to see more stark disparities, which is, again, part of the reason why cities can become these really important sites for struggle. So this idea of a just city, it's kind of this normative goal for many urban scholars, planners and geographers. What it looks like is going to be really different in lots of different places. And of course, we can discuss further, break down competing ideas of justice, and we could debate who has claims on that kind of justice, but that's a little bit outside of what I want to talk to you about today. Instead, I'd like to talk to you about some struggles to try and achieve this just city. So I'd like to talk about urban struggle and urban social movements that are seeking the kind of transformative change in cities from the grassroots, from the cracks in the concrete up. And as an interesting aside, some of the most interesting struggles globally that we're seeing for the just city, these radical projects designed at a complete overturning of the way that we produce and govern and live in urban spaces, are not actually coming from the biggest cities. Often they're coming from smaller and medium-sized cities. I'm not entirely sure why that's the case, but it's an interesting thing that's worth thinking about, especially as I think all of us are in places that would be smaller or medium-sized cities.